everybody to this debate for the motion public schools are a blight on British society. Now, I know you've already given your votes on the way in. Later you will be asked to vote using these forms, these voting slips, which you already have, but no need to worry about that for now, because we are going to have the introductory speeches. And our first speaker for the motion is an author and journalist. He's a stalwart of Private Eye, biographer of Marx, and his latest book is a study of the 1970s strange days indeed, the golden age of paranoia. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Francis Wheen.
Thank you very much. A few bits of business before we start. One is turn off mobile phones. No, that was you were meant to say that. The second is I have it on moderately good authority that there are quite a lot of people here tonight who went to public schools. I won't tell you what my source for this is, but I hope this won't in any way sway you. You will judge it on its merits, and you will look closely at the motion, which is that public schools are a blight on British society. It's nothing to do with how many A stars they get or anything else. It's about the blight business. And the second bit of business, to completely sabotage Francine's nice idea, is I'm going to tell you from the outset that I went to a public school, a place called Harrow, whose headmaster is sitting dangerously closely to me, actually, wearing the man in the red tie. So I'm trying not to tremble, but it does bring back some memories. I went to Harrow, and I hated it. He hasn't leapt out of his seat yet. The philistinism, the racism and anti-semitism, there was very little of that. The bullying, I got a lot of that, but that might have been just been me, I suspect. But what I most disliked about it was the self-confident smugness of my fellow pupils, who, even if they were drooling half-wits, and actually most of them were, or many of them were, took it for granted that they were born to rule. The school's songbook, which I brought along with me tonight, actually, just in case we have time for a sing-song afterwards, was full of this spirit. When Raleigh rose to fight the foes, we sprang to work and will. When Glory gave to Drake the wave, she gave to us the hill. This is the hill on which Harrow stands, so they can look down on the people below, in every sense. For we began when he began, he being Drake, our times are won. His glory thus shall circle us till time be done, till time be done. One day my voice will break. Till time be done. There's another school song that always used to amuse me, which is based on the fact that both Sir Robert Peel and Lord Byron went to Harrow. And the conclusion of this wonderful story is, none so narrow the range of Harrow welcomes poet and statesman too. And I used to listen to this and think, none so narrow the range of Harrow. Are they sure they've got that right? Perhaps they meant the opposite. But actually, none so narrow was a pretty fair summary of the sort of boys who went there with me. These were not people who'd ever have to worry about how to pay the rent. A lot of them wouldn't even need to find a job, which was probably just as well, actually. What a fine advertisement they were for the ruling elite, whose glory thus shall circle us till time be done. The Marquis of Blandford, who's been in and out of jail and rehab ever since. The Marquis of Bristol, who eventually pegged out after several decades of gobsmacking debauchery. One of my old roommates later fell foul, rather wonderfully, of the Medellin cartel in Colombia after trying to double-cross them in a drugs deal. And even the very dimmest boy in my house, this was rather magnificent, 10 years ago or so, managed to carry out the biggest mortgage fraud in British history. Looking back on it, I sometimes feel that the only one of my contemporaries at school who hasn't yet been to jail is Mark Thatcher, and it's not for want of trying. So by the age of 16, I could bear no more of this, and so I dropped out to become a hippie, as one did in those days. But I decided to give the old school a parting shot. There's a tradition at Harrow where you dish out photos of yourself with a message on the back. See you at Blenheim Palace this summer, Hollowls. Or more likely, see you in Wormwood Scrubs. And so I sent my old housemaster a photo of me wearing a Che Guevara beret when I was 16 at the time, with a quote from Henry Fielding's novel, Joseph Andrews. It's a character talking to Joseph Andrews about their host, a man called Wilson. "I have found it," he says. "I have discovered the cause of all the misfortunes which befell him. A public school, Joseph, was the cause of all the calamities which he afterwards suffered. Public schools are the nurseries of all vice and immorality." This didn't go down very well with my housemaster, and he sent me back a note, and a very angry note actually, demanding that I come up with a more positive message by way of farewell. And I really racked my brain, but I couldn't think of one. And 40 years on, as we Harrovians say, I still can't. Public schools, as the motion says, are a blight on British society. Look up blight in the OED, as I did. Any malignant influence of obscure or mysterious origin, anything which withers hopes or prospects. That's an unimprovable description, I reckon, of what these schools do to our society. Now, foreigners find it absolutely baffling that we even call them public schools when they're so obviously private schools. And it's easy for people like me to get a cheap political point out of ridiculing this phrase. But what's really telling is that the public schools themselves shy away from it. They prefer to call themselves independent. Why do they do that? Sheer guilt and shame and embarrassment, that's why. Because as they know, many of these so-called public schools began life as just that, places open to public applicants, charitable institutions, endowed for the education of poor and indigent scholars. Then time passed, they started taking fee-paying pupils. By the 19th century, of course, the well-to-do had colonised them for their own benefit and kicked out the ragamuffins. Yet even now, in the 21st century, these schools have charitable status, as if they were still fulfilling that original purpose. Eton. Has there ever been a more deserving charity? And the thing about these tax breaks is that they're worth a bob or two. They are, in fact, worth £100 million a year. That's £100 million annual subsidy to the public schools from taxpayers, all taxpayers, nurses, park keepers, state primary school teachers, to help the wealthiest people in the land keep their children on the fast track. You might always think the class war had been won by the upper middle class, and they were now forcing the vanquished proletariat to pay reparations. So don't these bastions of privilege, you might wonder with all this charitable nonsense, feel a tiny bit shamefaced about being subsidised by low-income families? Amazingly enough, not, at least not many of them. Under the 2006 Charities Act, they were put to the test. Public schools are now obliged to give something back to the community in return for all the perks and benefits they get. And there's a man called Andrew Grant, headmaster of St Albans and chairman of the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference, which represents the top public schools. "Let's be clear," he said last October at their conference, "the threat that currently underlies the Charity Commission's guidance is the well-tried medieval one of confiscation of land and property. It looks no less crude and ugly under the Rose of Labour than it did under the Rose of Tudor. Down in St Albans, we know about these things. In 1539, the monastery was dissolved." Now, if this man really can't see the difference between Henry VIII seizing the monasteries and the Charity Commission asking public schools to show a tiny flicker of charitable spirit now and again, God help the poor boys who have to be taught by him. According to Mr Grant, everyone, all of us, should be grateful for public schools because without them, and these are his exact words, Britain would not have enough officers to lead its army. There you have it, the swaggering superiority complex that characterises the public school blight. If people like Andrew Grant are asked to give a few means-tested bursaries every so often, they go on about social engineering. But what are Eton and Harrow and the rest of them, if not feats of social engineering on a scale worthy of Isambard Kingdom Brunel? Public school parents sometimes say to people like me, "How could you sacrifice your children by sending them to state school?" They're the ones who are making the sacrifice, I'd argue. Mine, my boys, who go to the local comprehensive, get a far better and broader education than any Etonians will ever have. The Eton boys may go on to be High Court judges, maybe even Prime Minister, God forbid, but at what cost? To rewrite Philip Larkin, they fuck you up, the public schools. Maybe it wouldn't matter so much if they only fucked up their own kind, but they fuck up the rest of us because they run the show.